a formula so potent it has been cited as grounds for disqualification in competitive bass fishing. Tournament officials called it an unfair chemical advantage over every commercial product on the shelf. And every single ingredient is sitting in your grocery store right now, for pennies. But before I hand you that formula, I need you to understand something that the entire bait industry is desperate to keep buried. Picture this. You are standing at the register of your local bait shop, handing over $20 for a tiny 2-ounce bottle of Pro Formula fish attractant. You get out to the water, squeeze every last drop onto your favorite lure, and you go home with nothing. Empty hands, crumpled receipt, bad attitude. Meanwhile, the guy across the dock, the one who showed up with a stained Ziploc bag of something that smells like a kitchen experiment gone horribly wrong, is pulling largemouth bass out of the same water like he has a private deal with every fish in the lake. What does he know that you don't? That is exactly what we are going to answer today. Welcome back to Forbidden Lures. If you are tired of getting skunked and spending your paycheck on synthetic snake oil, you are in the right place. Today, we are ripping the curtain off the multi-million-dollar bait industry. I'm going to break down the marine biology, the chemical signaling, and the evolutionary science behind why fish really bite, and why the tackle aisle is designed to make sure you never figure it out yourself. If I told you that cheap grocery store ingredients outperform a $30 commercial bottle, would you believe me? By the end of this video, you will not just believe me. You will have the exact blueprint to build it yourself. So stay with me until the very end, because I am going to hand you the ultimate super formula that will change the way you fish forever. And subscribe to Forbidden Lures now, because after today, your tackle box is about to get a whole lot cheaper. But first, I need to tell you something uncomfortable. Right now, every time you touch your lure with your bare hands, you are poisoning it. The invisible force field. Why you are repelling fish. Before we talk about what attracts fish, we need to have a serious conversation about why you are actively driving them away. Imagine dunking your lure in a bucket of bleach before every cast. That is essentially what your bare hands are doing, and you do not even know it. You have fished next to that guy who catches everything while you sit there getting skunked. Same water, same conditions, same bait. You figured he was just lucky. He was not lucky. His baits just did not smell like a biological hazard. Here is why. A fish's sense of smell is, by conservative scientific estimates, over 1,000 times more sensitive than a human's. A bloodhound's nose is 400 to 600 times better than yours. A fish completely blows that out of the water. They have tiny openings in their snout called nares, where water is constantly pumped across sensory organs called rosettes. These rosettes read the water molecule by molecule, telling the fish's brain exactly what is out there. And here is the problem. Your skin is broadcasting a chemical distress signal. Back in the early 1950s, two Canadian researchers named J.R. Brett and D. McKinnon ran an experiment that should have changed fishing forever. They tested over 54 different chemical substances on migrating fish. 54. And out of everything they tested, industrial chemicals, heavy metals, organic compounds, do you know what caused the most violent, most dramatic repellent response? Mammalian skin. Your skin naturally secretes an amino acid called L-serine. It is concentrated in your fingerprints, and the moment it washes off your hands onto a lure, it acts as the ultimate freshwater alarm signal. To a fish, a lure touched by bare human hands is a blaring warning that a land predator, a bear, a seal, a human, is in the area. In controlled experiments, trace amounts of L-serine caused migrating salmon to physically reverse direction and swim backward down a fish ladder in sheer panic. One fingerprint. That is all it took. And it gets worse. Think about what else is on your hands on a typical fishing trip. Bug spray, sunscreen, nicotine, gasoline from fueling the boat, marine grease, motor oil. If you get aerosol sunscreen or DEET-based bug spray anywhere near your baits, you might as well pack up and go home. So every lure you have ever cast with your bare hands was working against you before it even hit the water. The bait shop never told you that. They just sold you another bottle. But here is where it gets interesting. The cure for L-serine contamination has been known by a small circle of old-school bass fishermen for decades. They never advertised it, never sold it. They just quietly outfished everyone on the lake. And the answer has been sitting next to your coffee maker every single morning. The coffee ground paradox. Coffee. I know, it sounds ridiculous, but hardcore bass fishermen have sworn for decades that plastic worms stored in coffee grounds get more bites. People laughed at them, called it superstition, old wives' tale. Turns out, they were right, and the science backs it up completely. Coffee contains caffeic acid and chlorogenic acid, both of which actively neutralize the L-serine amino acid on contact. Think of it like a molecular eraser, wiping your chemical fingerprint clean off the lure. Furthermore, the roasting process of coffee beans significantly degrades potentially repellent amino acids, reducing them by over 50%. What is left behind is a scent profile that fish perceive as entirely neutral, invisible, harmless. By simply rolling your bait in dry coffee grounds before casting, or keeping a bin of dirt and coffee grounds to raise your live worms in, you completely erase the human scent signature. The L-serine spike that was screaming predator to every fish within range just vanishes into the background noise. Even better, professional anglers have been quietly washing their hands in cold coffee before touching their tackle. It strips away the sunscreen, the gasoline, the nicotine, and replaces it with an organic chemical profile that bottom feeders and game fish actually find attractive. Total cost to fix your scent contamination problem? Less than 1 cent per use. That $20 bottle of scent eliminator at the bait shop? Same chemistry, different price tag. And not a single bait company will ever print that on their label. Now that we have erased the bad scent, it is time to load up the good ones. And the first ingredient is one the bait shop industry is absolutely counting on you to dismiss. Garlic oil, the primitive dinner bell. Garlic. I can already hear you. Garlic? Really? On a fishing lure? And that reaction, that instant dismissal, is precisely what the bait industry is banking on. They need you to laugh at garlic. Because the moment you take it seriously, you will never buy another overpriced attractant off their shelf again. Let me show you what they do not want you to see. Garlic, Allium sativum, contains an active compound called allicin. Allicin is a dense organosulfur compound, and when it hits the water, it does something remarkable. It directly mimics the chemical signature of injured bait fish and decaying organic matter. But it goes so much deeper than just smelling like food. Fish are evolutionarily hardwired to consume garlic compounds, and the reason is almost unbelievable. In rigorous aquaculture studies on Nile tilapia, researchers exposed fish to a highly toxic agricultural pesticide called cypermethrin, a chemical that normally causes severe gill damage, liver degeneration, and stunted growth. Brutal stuff. But when researchers added just 1% garlic oil to the fish's diet, the results were staggering. The garlic acted as a powerful protective agent, minimizing or completely eliminating the severe tissue damage in the gills, liver, brain, and muscles. Think about that. Garlic did not just make fish eat more, it literally healed them from the inside. Fish that consumed garlic grew faster, ate more aggressively, digested food more efficiently, and showed dramatically lower oxidative stress. Over millions of years of evolution, fish that sought out sulfur-rich compounds like allicin survived longer and reproduced more. That instinct is burned into their DNA. So when you soak your bait in garlic oil for 30 minutes before casting, you are not just making it smell interesting. You are broadcasting a biological dinner alarm into every fish's olfactory system, signaling a food source that their deepest evolutionary programming tells them will heal them, boost their immunity, and make them stronger. A single crushed garlic clove and 2 tablespoons of olive oil, under 5 cents. That labeled bottle on the bait shop counter, $20 for the same chemical interaction. That is not a markup. That is highway robbery. But garlic is only half the equation. The next ingredient is one that tournament pros have been hiding since the 1960s, and the tackle industry is praying you never connect the dots. Anise oil, the masking agent and the danger zone. Anise oil. You know the smell, black licorice. It comes from the anise seed, and it contains a highly concentrated compound called anethol. Fish biologists classify anethol as a feeding trigger stimulant. It does not just passively attract fish, it drives aggressive predatory strikes. And because it is an oil, it is not water-soluble, meaning it clings tenaciously to hard baits and soft plastics, laying down a long-lasting scent trail that will not wash off the way water-based attractants do. Tournament anglers figured this out over 60 years ago. They have been quietly dipping their plastics in anise ever since, and the tackle industry has been hoping you never make the connection. But here is where anise gets dangerous, and I mean genuinely dangerous. Understanding this is the difference between catching the biggest stringer of your life and doing real harm. Anise oil is a double-edged sword. At low concentrations, it is an incredible masking agent and feeding trigger. But at high concentrations, anise oil is actually a potent sedative and anesthetic for fish. In clinical studies on common carp, researchers found that exposing fish to anise oil at a concentration of 100 milligrams per liter induced deep, stage 4 anesthesia, literally knocking the fish completely unconscious. Worse yet, at those levels, it caused severe damage to the gills, erosive lesions on the skin, inflammatory infiltration, and a 10% mortality rate. Some fish never woke up. So here is the critical lesson. Dilution is everything. 5 drops, not 6, not 10, not a generous pour. 5 drops of anise extract in your mix. That is the line between a feeding frenzy and a fish funeral. At 5 drops, you get the olfactory attraction and the human scent masking without any sedation. You use it sparingly, and it becomes one of the deadliest weapons in your tackle box. Now we have got the scent eraser. We have got the dinner bell. We have got the masking agent. But we are still missing the most critical piece, the raw amino acid payload that makes predatory fish completely lose control. The amino acid payload: shrimp paste and sardine oil. If you want to trigger a violent feeding response, not a curious nibble, not a lazy follow, but an all-out rod-bending strike, You need to deliver an amino acid payload directly into the water column. Walk into any Asian grocery store, go to the aisle that the bait industry prays you never visit, and pick up a jar of fermented shrimp paste. It is pungent, it is concentrated, it is biologically loaded. And it costs about $2 for a jar that will last you an entire fishing season. Here is why it works. During the fermentation process, the shrimp proteins are broken down into short-chain peptides and free amino acids. Published research identifies glycine, alanine, glutamic acid, and aspartic acid as the most frequently documented fish-feeding stimulants across dozens of common species. Shrimp paste is absolutely saturated with every one of them. It also contains betaine, a universally effective feeding stimulant proven to trigger feeding behavior across a massive range of freshwater and marine species. And the glutamic acid creates what scientists call an umami response, a deep, irresistible taste signal that drastically increases appetitive behavior in aggressive predators like hybrid snakehead and largemouth bass. Commercial carp bait manufacturers have been quietly adding betaine and shrimp extracts to their premium boilies for 30 years, charging you a fortune for what is essentially the same jar sitting on that grocery shelf for $2. A quick but serious warning for my Texas anglers. While fermented, processed shrimp paste from a jar is perfectly fine, never use imported frozen whole shrimp from the grocery store as raw bait in Texas waters. It is illegal. Imported raw shrimp can carry the deadly white spot syndrome virus, which survives freezing and can devastate native Gulf shrimp, crabs, and crawfish populations. Always use native Gulf shrimp if you are using whole bait. Do not skip this. It matters. Now, let us pair that shrimp paste with our next powerhouse, sardine oil. A can of sardines packed in oil costs maybe $1.20. And inside that can is a compound that evolution has spent hundreds of millions of years programming every predatory fish to chase. Trimethylamine oxide, or TMAO. TMAO is the compound that literally makes fish smell like fish. It is the universal underwater "something is bleeding and it is close" signal. When a bait fish is wounded and leaking TMAO into the water column, every predator within range gets the same ancient message. Prey is nearby and it is vulnerable. Chase it. Now. When you soak your bait in sardine oil, you are applying that exact signal. And because it is an oil, it clings to your lure and creates a slick that perfectly mimics the lipid trail of a bleeding, dying baitfish. Shrimp paste delivers the amino acid bomb. Sardine oil is the carrier missile. Together, they create a scent trail that reads like a wounded baitfish broadcasting its final coordinates. But we are not done yet. We have conquered the fish's nose and its taste buds. Now it is time to hack the two senses nobody talks about: vision and the lateral line. Visual and lateral line hacks. Beetroot and effervescence. Enter beetroot juice. Beetroot, Beta vulgaris, contains highly water-soluble, nitrogen-containing pigments called betalains. When beetroot juice hits the water, it does something incredible. It disperses rapidly, creating a vivid red or purple cloud that flawlessly mimics the visual signature of blood from an injured prey fish. Because it is water-soluble, the beetroot juice breaks away from the oil-based carrier on your lure and fans out fast and wide into the water column. This creates a massive, long-range visual beacon calling fish from a distance, drawing them straight toward the oil-soaked lure sitting at the center of that cloud. They see blood, they follow it, they find your bait. But we can push this even further, into territory that almost nobody is talking about. Fish possess a sensory organ called the lateral line, a series of incredibly fine hairs called neuromasts running down both sides of their body. The lateral line detects low-frequency vibrations, pressure waves, and turbulence in the water. It is so sensitive that at close range, a fish can strike a target in pitch-black water without using its eyes at all. Think of it as feeling someone's heartbeat from across the room. That is how precise it is. How do we trigger the lateral line? Effervescence. There is a U.S. patent, number 5,415,862, that describes exactly this concept. Someone actually tried to patent fizzing bait. By incorporating carbon dioxide gas-generating particles into a bait, the microbubbles produce high-frequency sounds and turbulence that the lateral line picks up instantly. Sound travels about 5 times faster in water than in air. Those tiny bubbles are screaming. And you can do it with a pinch of baking soda mixed with a little citric acid. Right before you cast, dust your lure with this mix. It fizzes underwater, simulating the gas escaping from a dying prey fish's swim bladder. Now picture the full ambush. The fish hears the fizzing. Its lateral line feels the turbulence. Its eyes see the red cloud spreading through the water. Its nose catches the garlic shrimp cocktail. Every sense, every survival instinct, every evolutionary trigger, all firing at once. It does not decide to bite. It cannot not bite. And that brings us to the moment you have been waiting for. It is time to build the formula. The Master Super Formula. Everything I have told you so far was preparation. This is it. This is the formula that tournament organizers classified as an unfair chemical advantage, and you are about to build it in your kitchen for less than $1. Step 1. Take 1 teaspoon of fermented shrimp paste and mash it with a tiny splash of warm water. This releases the free amino acids and nucleotides, your protein payload. Step 2. Add a pinch of dry coffee grounds. That is your L-serine eraser, neutralizing every trace of human scent you transfer while handling the bait. Step 3. Add 2 crushed garlic cloves or 1 tablespoon of garlic oil for the allicin and sulfur compounds. Then, add exactly 5 drops of anise extract for the anethol masking agent. Remember, 5 drops only. We are building a feeding frenzy, not a sedation chamber. Step 4. Pour in 2 tablespoons of sardine oil. This is your lipid carrier base, loaded with TMAO, the universal bleeding prey signal. Step 5. Add 1 teaspoon of beetroot juice for the water-soluble bleeding visual cloud. Mix it all together in a sealed glass jar and let it sit at room temperature for 24 hours. The compounds need time to meld, the amino acids bonding with the oil carrier, the flavors deepening, the chemistry locking together. When you open that jar the next day, it will smell like something unholy. That smell is the scent of every fish in the lake losing its mind. When you deploy this formula, you are simultaneously triggering the olfactory rosette, the gustatory taste receptors, the lateral line, and the visual cortex of virtually every freshwater predatory species in North America. Smell, taste, touch, sight, all at once. Total cost? Under $1. A professional-grade, biologically perfected, multi-sensory fish attractant for the price of a gas station coffee. The bait shop wants $30 for a watered-down version of what is sitting in that jar. The tackle industry wants you to believe you need their expensive synthetic chemicals to catch fish. But the science of the kitchen is vastly superior to the chemistry of the bait shop. It always has been. They just needed you to never find out. One important warning. Because this formula works as well as it does, you must always check your local regulations before using it. In some areas, broadcasting large amounts of organic material, known as chumming, is strictly prohibited because it can alter fish behavior or deplete oxygen in small, closed ecosystems. Some states classify it as giving an unfair advantage. Use this attractant responsibly, as a coating for your lures, not as a bulk broadcast. And never litter. If this deep dive into the real science of fishing blew your mind, hit that like button and subscribe to Forbidden Lures. Share this with a buddy who still wastes his money on $20 scent sprays. He needs to see this. Drop a comment below. What is the weirdest DIY bait or scent you have ever used that actually caught fish? I read every single one. Keep your lines tight, your hands washed in coffee, and your secrets close. This is Forbidden Lures. I will see you on the water.